از خون دل چونانه ها رخساره ها گلگون کنید. آمد یکی آتش سوار بیرون جهید از این حساب تا بر دم خورشید نو شب راز خود بیرون کنید. تا بر دم خورشید نو شب راز خود بیرون کنید. ای شاهدان بزمکین پیمانه ها پرخون کنید. دیدم به خواب نیمه شب خورشید و مه را لب به لب تعبیر این حال عجب ای صبح خیزان چون کنید. تعبیر این حال عجب ای صبح خیزان چون کنید. دیوانه چون طغیان کند زنجیر و زندان بشکند از زلف لیلی حلقه‌ای در گردن مجنون کنید. زنجیر و زندان بشکند از زلف لیلی حلقه‌ای در گردن مجنون کنید. از خون دل چونانه ها رخساره ها گلگون کنید. آمد یکی آتش سوار بیرون جهید از این حساب تا بر دم خورشید نو شب راز خود بیرون کنید. تا بر دم خورشید نو شب راز خود بیرون کنید. تا بر دم خورشید نو شب راز خود بیرون کنید.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's event, Legacy of Forugh Farrokhzad, a collaboration between the Poetry Center and the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State. We're so pleased to be with you today and to have our wonderful artists with us. This was a program we had scheduled last spring in April, but had to cancel it because of COVID-19. So here we are gathered together, and we hope that people from far and wide are with us for this wonderful event. I want to thank Steve Dickinson, my colleague at San Francisco State, for always being so game to collaborate. And I'm so thrilled that we have this opportunity to bring together all these writers to celebrate the life and legacy of this wonderful Iranian poet, Forugh Farrokhzad. Today, we're going to be pondering and celebrating and thinking about the ways that an artist and her life inspire the work of others, what the legacy of that artist's life means for those who come after. For many Iranians, both inside Iran and outside in the diaspora, Forugh Farrokhzad conjures so many deep and abiding feelings of truth breaking free, of belonging and unbelonging, of saying what must be said. She is a poet who dared to speak, dared to write, and to say what should and could not always be said. Her words belong to women and to the world, and today we're going to celebrate her through the work of those who have come after and draw on her for their inspiration. We're privileged to have with us three wonderful writers, all dear friends, and I'm going to read their biographies first, and then we'll start with Sholeh. Sholeh Wolpe is an Iranian-born poet, writer, and playwright. She's UCLA's inaugural writer-in-residence in 2018. She's the recipient of the 2014 PEN Heim, the 2013 Midwest Book Award, the 2010 Lewis Roth Persian Translation Prize, as well as artist fellowship and residencies in the US, Mexico, and Spain, Australia, and Switzerland. Her literary work includes 5 collections of poetry, several plays, 4 books of translations, and 3 anthologies. She travels internationally as a performing poet, writer, and public speaker, and has performed her literary work with world-renowned musicians nationally and internationally. She's a writer in residence at UC Irvine and lives in Los Angeles. Jasmine Darznik, who teaches at CCA, has been described by the San Francisco, her book, Song of a Captive Bird, has been described as a force to be reckoned with in literary circles. I'm sorry, back up. Jasmin Darznik's debut novel, Song of a Captive Bird, which I'm gonna hold up, was a New York Times bestseller and an editor's choice book and a Los Angeles Times bestseller. She's the author of the best-selling memoir, The Good Daughter, a memoir of my mother's hidden life. Her books have been published in 17 countries, and her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Her next book, historical novel set in 1920s San Francisco, The Bohemians, is forthcoming in 2021. She's a professor of English and creative writing at California College of the Arts. Finally, we'll have Shabnam Piryaei. Her work has been described by the San Francisco Book Review as a force to be reckoned with in literary circles. She's an award-winning poet, playwright, media artist, and filmmaker. In addition to authoring the books Nothing is Wasted, Forward, and Ode to Fragile, she's written and directed 3 poetry films that have screened at film festivals and art galleries around the world. She's been awarded first place in the Sonia Sanchez Langston Hughes Poetry Award, Poets and Writers Amy Award, the Transport of the AIM Poetry Prize, the Brain Mill Press Editor's Choice, and an Elizabeth George Foundation grant. She's currently directing a documentary film entitled There Is No Separate Survival, about asylum seekers across the US-Mexico border. She is a professor in the Becca, Broadcast and Electronic Communication Arts Department here at San Francisco State. Welcome all 3 of you, and we are so pleased to have you with us. The format for today is that each of the writers will read or share a little bit about their work and their connection to Forugh Farrokhzad, and then we'll resume a conversation after each one of them has an opportunity to share. And we invite you to leave your questions in the chat, the Q&A portion of the screen. and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. I also want to just give a shout out to the authors for their books that are relevant to today's program. Jasmine's novel, Song of a Captive Bird, is available in independent bookstores and online, and Sholeh's translations of Forugh Farrokhzad called Sin are also available from the University of Arkansas Press. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand the floor over to Sholeh, and thank you so much. Go ahead, Sholeh.
Am I on? Hi. It's very good to be here. Thank you. It's such an honor to be with such fine artists at the same time, talking about our favorite writer and poet, Forugh Farrokhzad. Let me give you a little bit of background about Forugh, because not all of you may know quite who she was. Forugh Farrokhzad is one of the most significant Iranian poets of the 20th century. Born in 1935, she was a poet of great audacity and extraordinary talent. Her poetry was the poetry of protest. What do I mean by that? Protest through revelation of the innermost world of us women, our intimate secrets, desires, our sorrows, our longings, our aspirations. She lived the way most women secretly longed to live, but lacked the daring or know-how, the women who lacked the daring and know-how. However, she did this at a great cost to her family life and to herself. She lost the custody of her only biological son and had to spend some time in a sanitarium where she was subjected to horrible electroshock therapy and endured great abuse by the media, who refused her the seriousness and respect granted to her male contemporaries. She died in a car crash at the age of 32, unfortunately, so we lost her at a very, very young age. My translations of Forugh Farrokhzad's poems, Sin, this is the second edition to the book that Persis showed you, Selected Poems of Forugh Farrokhzad, was published by the University of Arkansas Press. What happened after it was published? People loved her. When I began translating her work, I knew it was time for the world to become better acquainted with this remarkable poet who won the heart of a nation through her poetic talent and her perseverance and courage. She was years ahead of her time, both stylistically, in her poetic language, and in what she had to actually say and express. For the first time in the history, I think, of Iranian poetry, she dared to write from the perspective of a woman, socially, sexually, emotionally, politically. It was a great achievement. It had not been done before. Forugh and several of her contemporaries, in fact, also revolutionized the poetic language of a culture that was steeped in formal poetic style and difficult vocabulary. She employed language that was simple yet multi-layered. With each reading of her poem, you find yourself holding something new, and you feel compelled to go back to each poem, not because you didn't understand it the first time through, but because you know that there is more, always more, and you are never disappointed. So let me just read you a couple of his poems. I'm sorry, her poems. I was reading a note over there. All right. All right, I'm gonna put on my screen poem window I love this poem. Window. A window for seeing, a window for hearing, a window like a well that plunges to the heart of the earth and opens to the vast unceasing love in blue. A window lavishing the tiny hands of loneliness with a night's perfume from gentle stars. A window through which one could invite the sun for a visit to abandoned geraniums. One window is enough for me. I come from the land of dolls, from under the shade of paper trees in a storybook grove, from arid seasons of barren friendships and love in the unpaved alleys of innocence, from years when the pallid letters of the alphabet grew up behind desks of tubercular schools, from the precise moment children could write stone on the board and startled starlings took wings from the ancient tree. I come from among the roots of carnivorous plants, and my head still swirls with the sound of a butterfly's terror crucified with a pin to a book. When my trust hung from the feeble rope of justice and the whole city tore my lamp's hearts to shreds, when love's innocent eyes were bound with the dark kerchief of law and blood gushed from my dreams' unglued temples, when my life was no longer anything, nothing at all, except the tick-tick of a clock on the wall, I understood that I must deliriously love. One window is enough for me. A window to a moment of comprehension, perception, silence. The walnut sapling has grown tall enough to tell its leaves the meaning of the wall. Ask of the mirror the name of your liberator. Is not the trembling earth beneath your feet lonelier than you? The prophets brought the epistles of ruin to our age. These explosions without end, these poisonous clouds, are they not the peal of holy scriptures? O friend, O comrade, O blood brother, when you reach the moon, mark the day of the flowers massacre. Dreams always fall from the height of their own naivete and perish. It's a four-leaf clover I'm smelling, sprouted upon the grave of an archaic creed. Was the woman buried in the shroud of longing and chastity, my youth? Will I ever again climb the stairs of wonder to greet the good God who paces my roof? I sense that time has passed. I sense my share of moments is now a leaf of history. I sense this desk is just an illusory mask between my hair and this forlorn stranger's hands. Speak to me. What does one who offers you a living body's love want in return but a nod to her sense of existence? Speak to me from the sanctuary of my window. I am intimate with the sun. I want to read you one more poem if there is time. And this is a very, very important poem that Forugh wrote, and it's very close to my heart because I feel like whenever I read it, it just comes right out from inside my bones. Only voice remains. Why should I stop? Why? Birds have gone to seek their blue way. The horizon is horizontal, movement vertical, a gushing geyser. Bright stars spin as far as the eye can see. The earth repeats itself in space. Air tunnels become connecting canals, and day changes to an entity so vast it cannot be stuffed into the narrow imagination of the newspaper worms. Why should I stop? The path meanders among life's tiny veins, and the climate of the moon's womb will annihilate the cancerous cells. And in the chemical aura of after dawn, there will remain only voice, voice seeping into time. Why should I stop? What is a swamp but a spawning ground for corruption's vermin? Swelled corpses pen the morgue's thoughts. The cat hides his yellowness in the dark, and the cockroach, when the cockroach harangues, why should I stop? Printers' lead letters line up in vain. Lead letters in league cannot salvage petty thoughts. My essence is of trees. Breathing stale air depresses me. A bird long dead counseled me to remember flight. Fusion creates the greatest force. Fusion with the sun's luminescent soul. Comprehension flooding with light. Windmills eventually warp and rot. Why should I stop? I hold to my breasts sheaves of unripe wheat and give them milk. Voice, voice, only voice. The water's voice, its wish to flow. The starlight's voice pouring upon the earth's female form. The voice of the egg in the womb congealing into sense. The clotting together of love's minds. Voice, 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 only voice remains. In a world of runts, measurements orbit around zero. Why must I stop? The four elements alone rule me. My heart's charter cannot be drafted by the provincial government of the blind. What have I to do with the long feral howls of the beast's genitals? What have I to do with the slow progress of a maggot through flesh? It's the flower's blood-stained history that has committed me to life. The flower's blood-stained history. You hear? Forugh Farrokhzad. Get to know her. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sholeh. And those sumptuous translations are available in this collection called Sin. Next, we have Jasmine Darznik, who's gonna read from her novel, Song of a Captive Bird. So take it away, Jasmine.
Hello. So wonderful to be here and to share our common love for Forugh. She's so important to so many of us, so beloved, and I feel I'm in good company tonight. So I wanted to tell you a bit about the writing of Song of a Captive Bird, and then I will read to you from the novel. My memory of Iran, my last memory of Iran, involves Forugh, actually. My family and I left Iran in 1978. There was a lot of tumult that year. And like many families, many people who were leaving Iran at that time, we left in a hurry and we didn't know if we were ever going to come back. I was 5 years old and I remember it was snowing in Tehran that night. And as my mother was packing up, my grandmother put me on her lap and we were watching Gugush, who's a the great pop diva of Iran. And my mother kept saying, we'll be back, we'll come back. And something that night made her go over to the bookshelf and, even in that chaotic moment, retrieve her favorite book, which was a book of poems by her idol, Forugh Farrokhzad. I like to think that something in my mother knew that she would need those poems. When I left home, my mother's book of Furugh's poems was one of the only things I took. It was in college that I learned to read Furugh's poems in the original Persian. I had by that time devoured Sylvia Plath and Adrienne Rich and so many wonderful American and English writers, but I was hungering for a voice that was in some way mine, an Iranian voice, a woman from Iran speaking to me as I think only another woman from Iran could speak to me. Forugh wrote about desire, she wrote about pain, she wrote about courage, she wrote about fear. Reading her was a revelation to me. The very existence of her poems proved that stereotype of Iranian women, as silent victims of their fate, wasn't true. That was everything that America was telling me Iranian women were, and at the same time, everything that Iran was telling Iranian women they shouldn't be. I think those poems saved me in so many ways, and they still do. When I finished writing my first book, which was a memoir about my mother and the story of how she had given up a child in Iran before she married my father, I almost immediately seized on Forugh as a subject for a novel. I knew I wasn't done with Iran, or Iran wasn't done with me. And so I decided to tell Furugh's story, which so many Iranians know, but very few people outside of Iran know. When I would speak to Americans about her, even academics, people who knew the world of poetry, global poetry quite well, they'd never heard of her. And so it became something of a challenge to introduce her, this extraordinary woman, to an American audience that might not otherwise know about her. And I decided to do it in the form of a novel. The novel is deeply researched. It draws on hundreds of secondary and primary sources, Furugh's travel log, her letters to her first husband, but the most important source material that I used for Song of a Captive Bird were Furugh's own poems. The book is at heart a woman's coming of age story, but it's also the story of Iran at one of the most tumultuous junctures of its history. My hope is that readers come away feeling respect for Furugh's tenacity, her vision, her resilience, her dignity, her sensitivity, but also to feel the tragedy and the terror that has marked the lives of so many generations of Iranians now. I'm going to read actually from the last part of the book, from Song of a Captive Bird. It's one of the first things I wrote, but it wound up being at the end. And I think it's appropriate for today because we're talking about legacy and we're talking about inheritance. And this is the part of the book where I really bring that to the fore. So from Song of a Captive Bird. Many years after I died, 1 million books of my poems could be found throughout my country, hidden under beds and behind bureaus, crammed behind bookshelves, and in the deepest reaches of drawers. 1 million books of poetry. It was a staggering number and unequal even to the ambition I'd had when I was alive. By then, the 1979 revolution and war with Iraq had left very few families untouched by loss, and hundreds of thousands of Iranians had left the country and were now scattered all around the world. People read my work and claimed I'd foretold our country's destiny in it, the chaos, the ruin, the tortures, the silences, the sons who died, the daughters who disappeared. In Iran, they read my poems as auguries, and they called my death a blessing because it had spared me from watching my prophecies come true, one after another for so many years. Once, when my poems were banned by the new regime and a publisher wouldn't stop printing them, his press was burned to the ground, as if poetry could be destroyed like a building or a body. But art wasn't like that. Art could survive even when suppressed, even when outlawed. It could survive far worse fates than fire. There was a day in the new millennium when hundreds of thousands of people gathered in the streets of Tehran. People called it the green path, green for the Prophet Muhammad as they knew him, humane, gentle, generous. The faith in the streets was one reborn from our own roots. People chanted my verses as they marched peacefully toward Azadi Tower that spring, but I wouldn't be there to see it, nor would I be there to witness the loss of so many young men and women along the path of my country's bloody and aborted push toward freedom. God is the only God, came the cries as I was lowered into the ground. The sun was a pale white circle above the Alborz mountains. The wind blew faintly, stirring the sweet, smoky perfume of wild rue. A ring of mourners encircled the grave. At last, the funeral prayers began. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, forgive those of us who are living and those of us who are dead, those of us who are present and those of us who are absent. Forgive us and forgive her. I was turned to the right side, toward Mecca, toward the one who is the only one. Salutations on the prophet, a supplication for the deceased, a pause, a silence, and then the first fistfuls of soil fell upon my body. I feel the earth calling me back to itself. I'm ready now. Swallows would one day lay eggs in my ink-stained palms. Tender green shoots would force their way out of my grave and up toward the air. All this would happen later in the spring when the sun warmed the earth and the sky. But already I had reached a place where censure and suffering are meaningless, where courage has no boundaries, where hope lasts forever and does not fade. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Jasmine, sorry. Thank you so much. Again, that's from her novel, Song of a Captive Bird. And last, we are going to have Shabnam Piryaei, who's going to share with us her poems and her film project. And I'm going to guess it's somewhat inspired by Forugh Farrokhzad's very wonderful film, The House is Black. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. You can see it on YouTube. So Shabnam, without further ado.
Hello, thank you for having me. Man, what a lovely experience to sit and listen to literature. It's been a really long time for me. I'm actually just going to start with a couple of my own poems, and then I'll talk a little bit about the film excerpt that I'm going to show. So this first piece is entitled, There is No Separate Survival. And this line is actually taken from an Audre Lorde essay. "12, you stood unstartled as goldfish burst like capillaries in your plastic water-filled bag. The soldier fumbling dropped mints into the empty gape of your bucket, compromised by the anchor of your linger. The night they hunted you from your bed into the water, zippers chafing, eels careening through the ebony, sowing their garbage-fisted scald, their elemental theft. Half drowned, you summoned a wire of light on the dusty underside of a bench. All that morning you had been waiting for the first slow fruit of a slender apricot tree. This next poem is entitled Next Door App, which some of you may have on your phones. A young man desperately buries himself under damp leaves. While helicopters hunt him, police laugh as he tries to hide in the foliage. A neighbor with a device to eavesdrop on scanners catches this tidbit, shares it with the online group. Crime doesn't pay, LOL. You think the leaves make you invisible? Meanwhile, he lies on his back on the wet grass of a stranger's yard, weaving a fast and futile dwelling from the earth. What does it feel like to be held this way by the whole world pressing your back, dew slicking your eyebrows, thinking of your mother who is putting your baby girl to sleep, your second grade teacher who framed your first poem, your fourth grade teacher who told you you won't be shit, your sister who followed you from room to room wanting you to play with her, your two cousins shot in the same week, one in the pupil, another in the lung, and for a moment you nearly weep, but no. You lie perfectly still, directly in the white beam of light, rivulets running from magnolia leaves down your temples into the soil. I want to leave time for the video, but there's, so those two poems were from, well, actually the first poem, There's No Separate Survival, is from my most recent book, which is entitled Nothing is Wasted. And then the piece I just read, Next Door App, and the excerpt I'm going to read now are from the book that I'm working on now, which is entitled All Children Magazine, which is what this poem is called. And so this begins with a little corresponding newspaper excerpt that I'm going to read for a second. It's from CNN, April 2018. The newspaper article says, one video shows 12-year-old Hassan and his sister Jodi, a 1-year-old toddler in diapers, lying motionless on the floor next to a washing machine. Why must children sleep with such devastating freedom that toddler corpses mirror perfect slumber? Sarin pries through the weave of a body, but not all carnage is stark as annihilation, stepping with blood-spattered socks along a sacrum. Not all carnage a hog-tied adolescent in a den of confessions. A 10-year-old boy, handcuffed at his grandmother's house, wets himself on camera. There is nothing pure. White snow blanketing rabbits in a field. So I'm going to show what I've done is I've created essentially a short adaptation of a documentary I'm working on now, which is entitled No Separate Survival, which is about asylum seekers across the US-Mexico border. And I just want to say, I know Persis mentioned The House is Black. The very first encounter I had with Forugh's work was seeing that film, and it blew my mind. And we can talk more about this certainly in the discussion, but it was one of those moments with a particular kind of artist where I was made aware of my own limitations. The piece, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a short documentary that she'd been commissioned to make, a medical documentary in a leper colony in the north of Iran. But she created this piece that is a visual poem and a documentary and media art, and it's so beautiful and it's so tender, and it has poetry in it, but it gave me, I think, a sense of possibility in terms of what poetry can be and how it can generate art that isn't always necessarily just living on the page. So I'm going to try to share the excerpt now, so just give me a moment here.
Where's my armor? I'm not convinced the only avenue to joy is one solitary writhe in the foam-mouthed dark, one fervent anchor hungering through a ribcage, one bullying nothing. Above the roof, a cloud builds itself through variation.
I walk for days carrying a big bag of cans of fruit and water, and walking for days in the desert, that itself, it was really hard.
Being a child and moving to the US, you don't really think, oh, I'm legal. I was brought here by my mom.
I crossed the border when I was 14. If the Border Patrol has found us, I would be back in Honduras, living, I don't know, miserable. No sabría qué sería de mi vida.
There's a saying in Mexico, Pueblo Chico, Infierno Grande, which means small town, big hell. They would have this perception of what a man should be. And I was an easy target.
Discomfort, held fast gifts gaping wealth, draws you like a calf unruly and wet from the dissonant flesh.
There's just an unrelenting drive to save their lives. If the choice is to die with their families at home, or at least to die trying to save their lives and maybe some of them make it, maybe their children make it, that's what's propelling them. They are some of the most resilient, amazing people, some of the best parents you will ever meet, some of the most intelligent people you will ever meet. And I couldn't survive what they've survived.
Every inheritance is a compass. Uncertainty, too, is riddled with light.
I think we have to change our society. My family had been obliterated in pogroms and holocausts in Europe and Russia. And I was interested early on in why people in my family seemed to be very concerned about my safety. Now I understand that more, that my life was more precious than it would have been otherwise, because there had been so many who failed to live.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm navigating. Thank you so much. So that's all of my portion. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, thank you so much, Shabnam, for your lovely work. So as you can see, we've gone from the direct translation of Forrough's words, novelistic rendition, to the inspiration that Forugh has provided, for example, for Shabnam. We're going to talk a little bit together about Forugh and her legacy and the ways that each of these writers has approached their project, their respective projects, and also the idea of how we make this poet, who to many people is still quite unknown, how do we make her part of the landscape of global poetry? She certainly speaks to many of us as women and as people who I think are concerned with the idea of truth, but I also think she's a fantastic poet, and I think Sholeh's translations really afford that access to her beautiful words. So I want to start by just saying thank you to each of you for your lovely work and for the ways that you bring Forrough's life to us, to a different audience. And I want to hear a little bit from you about how you feel like her work still influences your work, and also what's generative about her life and work for you or others that you know, and what does her poetry mean to you? So that's a lot of things, but just in general, seeing these other writers and their work, I'm curious about what you see of Forugh in terms of her influences, and what does it generate for you personally, and how can we sort of bring that voice of hers to an even greater amplification? And I'll just let you take the floor, whoever is feeling inspired.
Okay, I always feel inspired by Forugh. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I had this collection of Forugh's work that I had to hide in my house because I wasn't allowed to have it. My parents deemed it a little bit too adult for me. And that is my only surviving possession from Iran. That important, imagine that. She has been a source of inspiration to me from the time I was little. And so this is what's important. This is what's so inspiring about Forugh Farrokhzad. Like I said earlier, her poetry is this beautiful multi-layered flower that, you know, or onion that you just kind of peel and peel and peel. And the more you go into it, the more it grows with you. That's amazing. That's an incredible achievement. Also, I've always felt incredibly emboldened by her work, that, you know, here's an Iranian, a woman from my culture who speaks like that, who expresses herself like that, who's lived a fearless life. And in a way, her life, knowing about her life and who she's been, has emboldened me to go forward in my own work, in my own poetry and writing.
Thank you. Jasmine.
Sure. So I really did not think I could be a writer. I didn't think that was a possible pursuit for me. You know, I grew up in a family, Iranians love their ancient literature. You know, so I grew up in an environment that venerated the poets of the Middle Ages, Rumi and Hafez. But I was made to feel that as a woman, and I do think it was as a woman, I didn't have anything important to say, that I didn't have the language and the learning and the erudition to contribute anything. And so encountering Forugh was the beginning of imagining myself as a writer. And it mattered that she was Iranian. I had a lot of wonderful idols around me as I was studying literature, but it really mattered that she was Iranian and that she'd chosen actually to stay in Iran long past when it was comfortable for her. And I think so many of her, though she's writing 50, 60, 70 years ago now, so much of what she's writing, I think we can say still echoes down through history. And this feeling of, for example, what do we do with what we inherit? How can we transform a legacy of trauma, let's say? These are things that I think are so timeless. And so it was having a woman, an Iranian woman, who is grappling with some very essential questions that have become my questions too. That was tremendous. And I really don't think in the pantheon, you know, of great writers for me, no one quite has that place that Forugh did. She helped me see what might be possible for me.
Shabnam?
Hi, frantically taking notes. Well, so, you know, I mentioned a moment ago that my first encounter with any of her work was seeing the documentary. And I didn't actually read her poetry in Farsi until I was in college, because I couldn't, because I didn't know how to read and write Farsi, because I came here when I was 2 and I studied it for years in classes and in college. And I have always and still do feel a disconnect and a lack in terms of my own connection to my poetic heritage. I literally don't understand when I read poetry in Farsi. I still don't get it. I still have to like find a tutor to make me understand it. But when I could read and write Farsi well enough, I started reading Forugh Farrokhzad's poetry in Farsi. And it is my only connection to what I feel like is my literary heritage as an Iranian poet. And it was, I mean, you know, it's like Sholeh was saying, like I think a lot of amazing literature, it's something that I have returned to for years. And it's always giving me something new, something meaningful, something beautiful. And there's something in the risk that she's constantly taking when the stakes are so very high. As a writer, you know, emotional risks, but also given the, you know, the social and historical context that she was in, that, you know, even now when I have conversation about Forugh Farrokhzad, people are so eager to talk about scandal and, you know, just entertainment news, almost sort of elements around her life that I can't imagine what it could have been like at that time to have been writing, you know what I mean? So I think those things definitely, you know, as Jasmine was saying, embolden me, remind me of, I feel like, what is my responsibility as a writer and as an Iranian woman poet, for sure.
I'll just add one thing about Forugh's influence on me was that my father went to Iran one time before the revolution in 1976. And I remember it so well because I was in 8th grade and I went to my 8th grade graduation. My father had just gone to Iran and he came back and he brought me three Gugush 45s and a collection of Forugh Farrokhzad's poetry. Of course, it was in Persian, it wasn't translated, but he read it to me. And I remember thinking the power of these two women's voices had such an impact on me. Like I didn't even know what manoto meant, but I stood in the living room listening to this 45 and my father read the poems to me. And I remember thinking, wow, you know, I want to be a part of that. So I think that, you know, in a strange sort of way, her voice captivated me even through my father's voice reading it. So I really loved that Only the Voice Remains poem for that reason. I wondered if this could be a moment, Sholeh, where I could ask you to read a poem or an excerpt of a longer one in Persian for those people who haven't heard the Persian, because I think it's also extremely beautiful.
I'm happy to. This is a I love this poem. This is from the title of the book. It's called Sin, and I read it just in the first stanza in English, so you see how it starts and where it's going. And then I read a little bit of the Persian. This is the poem that got her in trouble in the very, very beginning. I have sinned a rapturous sin in a warm and flamed embrace, sinned in a pair of vindictive arms violent and ablaze. You know, she was violating a lot of rules by writing this at age 18 in Iran. I'll read a couple of stanzas. گناه کردم گناهی پر ز لذت در آغوشی که گرم آتشین بود. گناه کردم میان بازوانی که داغ و کینه جوی و آهنین بود. در آن خلوتگاه تاریک و خاموش نگه کردم به چشم پرزرازش. دلم در سینه بیتابانه لرزید ز خواهش‌های چشم پرنیازش. در آن خلوتگاه تاریک و خاموش پریشان در کنار او نشستم. لبش بر روی لبهایم هوس ریخت ز اندوه دل دیوانه رستم. That's part of her poem. I love that. That is, you know what, that is such a sexy poem. It's Sin, and she's talking about, she's claiming what women were not claiming at the time, which is, yes, I can have physical relationship. Yes, I can enjoy it. Yes, I can drink wine and it's okay. Oh God, I don't know what I did, but hey, I had a really good time. And this was really difficult for people at the time to accept, not that because this kind of poetry was not being written. It was just not being written by women. Men were allowed to write it, to claim that kind of thing, but to write it from a perspective of a woman, And it's funny because after this poem was published in a magazine, there was a great many letters arrived at the publisher's desk. You know, who is this woman? Who's this whore? Who's this woman of loose moral value? Why are you writing this? And of course, every man claimed to have been the man in the poem. That's what was going on at the time.
I want to tell you, Sholeh, I got revenge on him on Furugh's behalf. That man, there was a man who, came forward and then he wrote, a short story that was quite devastating and devastated Forugh. And I changed many of the names in Song of a Captive Bird, but I kept his name in there. And it was, one of these sometimes it's just for yourself, but it was so satisfying to name this man who had betrayed her and who had hurt her so terribly at that time. So, yeah.
I'm gonna read a few of the questions from the audience because I think they're sort of germane to some of where we're going here. So there's a question from Hannah, who says, thank you so much for being here. And she wants to know what parts of Furugh's legacy resonate with your own diasporic experiences.
I mean, I can go on. I don't want to talk too much, but I mean, what part of it doesn't resonate with anyone? Listen, when the book Sin came out, I mean, we thought it would be modestly, it's poetry in translation, okay? Let's face it. How does poetry in translation do in the United States, where translation is not really being published that much? It did amazing. I would get a letter. Once I got a letter from this young male student in the cornfields of Iowa or somewhere in the Midwest, and he wrote me. He said, "Thank you for translating Forugh Farrokhzad. She changed my life." So what part of her wouldn't resonate with anyone? It is voice, voice, voice. Only voice remains. Who wouldn't say that? Anyway.
Jasmine, you also said something that resonated with me, was that I was looking for somebody who had something that was similar to my life, right? An Iranian. So I think that the idea also that there's this woman who defies a lot of the social norms of her time, who's bold, who's a writer, who doesn't mince words, that certainly is something that many of us didn't have the opportunity to have, either growing up in the United States or being, a younger person in the United States. So I think there's also that idea that her life and her image is in some ways a counterpoint to some of the, stereotypes and the heavy overlay of what Iranian women should or have been. And certainly I think even my own father wanted me to sort of be a proper lady. And I remember saying, she's not a proper lady, So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was brought up more Iranian than I might have been if I stayed in Iran, honestly. I mean, I think it's so bedeviling. Yeah, it's so confusing. But I think there's this way in which when we came, time froze or it actually went backward. And I see this with other women that, are my contemporaries, is that we were losing so much as a community, and it felt like everything got hoisted upon the young women, and so the culture was somehow, we felt like it was our duty, and a lot of us rebelled against it for sure. But I think, what Forugh was writing about in the 50s and 60s, about wanting to be free, wanting to be sexual, wanting to be artistic. You know, I wanted those things so much. And within my family, it was not allowed. Yeah. I mean, there was so much prohibition. And I think I recognized in Forugh, when I read Furugh's poetry, you know, I found a voice for that confusion, that pain. You know, it was so validating. I mean, on the deepest level, to see my experience voiced in that way. Yeah. And so, you know, again, I guess I just go back to how indebted I feel, or so fortunate I feel that I encountered her work, because it allowed me to be freer. Yeah.
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 Shabnam, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, you know, I think that so I left Iran when I was 2, and I think that and I didn't grow up around a lot of Iranians. And so there is this sense sometimes where it's unclear where the line is between like what is Iranian culture and what is like what your family is doing. And that's kind of hard to distinguish sometimes for diasporic Iranians, I think. And I think that poets, or really people like Forugh Farrokhzad, when I read her poetry, it sort of allowed me to get past the strict rhetoric of, like, for example, my father, who also had very particular expectations. But my father was the first one who introduced me to Forugh Farrokhzad, and he's a poet as well. And so there's also an interesting dynamic with when things are put in poetry form, there's almost more room to take those risks. And so that was really interesting. But I think for me, it allowed me to connect to a more human, complex identity of what it means to be Iranian in Iran. Which I think is really, you know, for those of us who are here, I was here, I didn't go back to Iran until I was 17 years old. And so I didn't really have a concept of what it means to be Iranian in Iran, besides, you know, my parents' nostalgia. And so seeing it from that perspective, being able to read her poems, being able to read her journals, which I read, you know, I was like voraciously reading everything she'd written in Farsi after I was able to read it. And it gave me so much insight. And I think it really did make me feel, allowed me a little bit to see my place in that narrative, in that broader narrative. And that was really impacting for me.
It's really beautiful to see that, you know, it's an all-women panel, but I would really like to also mention the work of Dr. Farzaneh Milani, who she has dedicated her entire scholarly life to writing about Forugh Farrokhzad. She wrote a beautiful biography of her with all her letters, everything. It's in Persian. Shabnam Jun, I hope you can read it, but I hear it's going to be translated. So I just wanted to mention her name because she's my mistress, my master.
Yeah, and she's given a few lectures both in Persian and English, which you can find on the internet. So I encourage people to seek her out, Farzaneh Milani. There's a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to field them. This one might be more germane to you, Sholeh. Tara asks if you know the poem A Call to Arms. It was not published in any of her books, but in an Iranian journal, and it was criticized for being sloganeering and immature. And I always wondered why, because it seems so captivating and raw. What are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, I have not seen that poem. I saw that question and I'm not familiar. I will certainly look it up and I'll ask Dr. Milani, Farzaneh Milani about it, but I don't know. Jasmine John, do you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's her most explicitly feminist poem, excuse me. And I wonder how much of that decision was hers actually not to publish it, because she had a very complicated relationship with the feminists of the time. Yeah. And so that, perhaps it's owing to the I don't know if I want to say tension, but she certainly was not someone who called herself a feminist, and the feminists didn't like her. I mean, most particularly because she was a woman who was writing about sexuality, and that was not, if you wanted to be a card-carrying member of the Feminist Party in Iran, you know, in mid 50s, 60s, you know, there was this kind of erasure of the female body of female sexuality, and so I just wonder if it has to do perhaps with the way that she wanted to distance herself from that more ideologically driven. She was never part of any party, you know. I mean, you can guess her sympathies, but I think she always wanted to sort of, you know, she wanted to claim a space for poetry that was not entirely eclipsed by politics or ideology. Yeah, so you can read the echoes of those things in her poems. They energize the poems, but there's a subtlety to how she handles women's liberation, for example.
Yeah,
so.
she does oft in an interview, she said, well, of course I write as a woman because of course I'm a woman. How else can I write? But I don't want that to define me. I want to be a poet. So that's exactly what you've been saying, Jasmine.
There's a question here, which I'm sure I could answer, but are any of you aware of her poems being read or studied in Iranian college, or are they censored? So.
Oh. Well, initially, her books were censored after the 1979 revolution, and the publisher refused to stop publishing her work. The press was burnt down. But now there is no stopping anything. I believe when I was translating, I had to be very careful that the books that I got in Persian came from outside of Iran, so that nothing was censored. So if you get something from Iran directly, sometimes whole sentences, words, sections would just not be there. And, you know, so that does exist.
I was going to hold up. This is the Persian translation. It was done. No, hold on. It was done without my, you know, they just do it, right? They don't. Then they tell you about it. But I wanted to say the translator got in touch with me, and he said that nowhere on the book, and the book did really, you know, quite well. It's gone into a lot of reprintings there. But nowhere in the book did they use Forugh's name, and they said they did that purposefully because her name on the book cover would, you know, prima facie, it would ban the book. I mean, they wouldn't be able to get it past the censors, which is really interesting. And another decision they made is they wrote my name to make it sound American, and they said that if it's an American writer, that writer gets a lot more latitude than an Iranian writer. So they sort of Americanized me in order to get this book published. So I mean, that gives you a little window onto the creative ways that her work is, and, you know, stories about her are being circulated, but also the enduring, you know, prohibitions against her work and her name and what she stands for. They closed down the cemetery, is my understanding, on the anniversary of her death. Every year, so many people go, and you know, that they have preemptively closed the cemetery because they don't want people to congregate there. She's a lightning rod still, you know.
Jasmine, John, can I see it's her picture though on the cover, right?
You know, this is actually, they pulled this from an illustration that was in an American book called The Feminist Book of Patron Saints. So it was a Random House book that came out, and so they just helped themselves to it, if you will, and so it has a home in Iran now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's a question here about Ebrahim Golestan, among others, says that Forugh's later poems were stronger and more intelligent compared to her earlier work. Do you agree? And considering that her later poems moved away from her usual subjects of female desire and sexuality to the politics of the time, what do you think Golestan's evaluation says about the male intellectual culture in Iran and its effect on female voices.
Okay, I was just gonna say something. You know, I'm a poet, right? And from the time you write, from the age 17 to age 30, 40, 50, of course your work, especially if you are living in a country like Iran and it's dynamic and you're struggling against so many social movements that are going on, of course your work is gonna change. Whether it gets better or worse, I'm not gonna say, but of course she's not gonna write about the same things she's writing about at age 18 or 19 or 20. But I'm not sure about the accuracy of this, the quote in the question from, I've never met Mr. Golestan, I have great respect for him, but I doubt he would have said something. She was an extraordinary talent from the start to the finish.
Excellent. Okay, this question is for you, Sholeh, about translation. Denise says that your translation captured the emotion and musicality of Forroukh's poetry so well. What are some of the challenges you faced in bringing her writing into the English language?
There are many challenges in the art of translation, period. Particularly in Persian language, and I'm sure Shabnam Jan, you've been studying it, and Jasmine Jan, the language is syrupy, it's gorgeous, it's delicious, it's sweet, it's candy in your mouth. But the moment you want to transport it into another language like English, if you transport it as its sugary, beautiful self, it'll become cliche city, right? And it does not transport well, right? That's why it's very important. It was very important for a poet to translate her work, because her work needed to be recreated in English so that it is poetry, so that it is not murdered in the process. So for me, that was a lot of challenge, because I had to fuse my own poetic voice with Forroukh's poetic voice, and not betray her, but also not betray her by presenting something that's gooey and sugary in English, something that is as fresh and beautiful and inspiring as it is. So that's, yeah.
Right.
It's quite challenging.
So, you know, there's a lot of lore around her death. And so this person, Saba's question is relating to the death of Forugh Farrokhzad at the very young age of, what did you say, 34?
32.
32. And, you know, some people have attributed it to assassination, suicide, a car wreck. It was actually a car wreck. Is there any significance to these narratives, do you think? Or are they irrelevant to how she lived her life and what she made in her poetry and what she leaves behind? And maybe Jasmine, this is a question.
I mean, because I knew when I wrote Song of a Captive Bird, to some extent, I had to solve the mystery of how she died. Yeah. So she dies, everybody. I guess that's, you know, I guess I'm going to give it away, the story, but, you know, every Iranian knows the story of her death and the mythology around her death. And Iran is, I think it's fair to say it's a martyrdom culture. And there's a lot of talk when you hear about Forroukh's death, there's a lot of this talk of Forugh as this sort of martyr, that she was too good for her times, that she, you know, she couldn't live because the world was too corrupt, you know, and how grateful. I think in the passage I read, I was echoing this a little bit and saying that, you know, people say how fortunate it is that she passed away when she did in the 60s, and that she didn't live on to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, because she surely would have met a terribly gruesome fate as her brother did. And so I think writing the book, I knew I had to to write it in such a way that it would embrace the mythology, but also that it would also satisfy a reader that needs to know to some degree of certainty what happened. Yeah, but also retain some mystery around it. And I think a lot about, if you read Song of a Captive Bird, I think most of us would say she died in an accident. But what's an accident? I mean, an accident is also the last point in a sequence of causality. So Forugh was absolutely tormented by the regime of her time, by the mores of her culture, by the lover she took, by the family that was scandalized by her. And I think now of the accident that killed her as the sum of all of these forces that could not let her be free in that time, in that place. So that's my take on it. You can read the novel to see, sort of how I solved it. It was a really tricky kind of, part of the book. And, I hope I did it justice. I hope I honored her in the way that I told the story and the version of her death. I also think it's important, for me, it was very important that the death be just one part of the story. So we are very preoccupied by Forugh's sexuality, that's the one thing, and then we're preoccupied by the horrible way she died. These are the two, these two things are what we've been orbiting. And I think as important as it was to write about that death, I also wanted to restore her in life and to make her a woman who had many challenges that we recognize, So that was also sort of a great ambition of mine, was to tell the truth in a way that honored the life too.
Yeah, in Dr. Farzaneh Milani's book, she actually tells us what happened. And if you stay for the after party, I will tell you.
I'm too Iranian. I don't believe anything. I don't know that you can know, but we'll talk later.
Yeah, but there is, have you read that?
I have.
It actually solved certain things for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's what happened, but it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to bring Shabnam more into the conversation, and I want to talk a little bit about The House is Black. There is one question, and the person has to leave, so I want to see if anybody, including you, Shabnam, because the other two folks have been talking. I can't get to it. Let's see. Well, Roshanak asked the question about, do we think that Forugh was a particular kind of genius that was beyond her gender as a woman, her boldness, that her boldness, as well as in combination with her ambition, made her like other writers in the Iranian context, like Sadegh Hedayat, but especially a kind of genius. I'm sorry, the question's disappeared, so I can't quite see it. I don't know what genius means it has different connotations, but I think that in some ways the question is about what afforded her the ability to be so very bold and to eschew some of those mores and survive at least as long as she did.
I just want to say to that I think that being starkly honest is sometimes just an act of survival. And so I think that that's what it was for her. And actually, I'm going to read a quick quote that I had wanted to say that's from Audre Lorde that I think also is my response to this. It's a very short quote from the poet Audre Lorde, and it's an excerpt that I had wanted to reference. And so she says, "And I tell you this, my friends, there will always be someone seeking to use one part of yourselves and at the same time urging you to forget or destroy all of the other selves. And I warn you, this is death. Death to you as a woman, death to you as a poet, death to you as a human being. When the desire for definition, self or otherwise, comes out of a desire for limitation rather than a desire for expansion, no true face can emerge. That's my answer.
Right.
I love Audre Lorde. That's a beautiful quote. But one thing I think I'd really like for all the viewers to know and or to be reminded of is that the question of veiling, right? So we went from a time in our history where women were brought out, the veil was forcefully taken away from the women. You know, it was illegal to be with a veil on. And what happened is that as women were unveiled, another veil was thrown on them, and it was on their voices, on the way they express themselves. Before, they could do that within their own Andaruni or area where women ruled, but now they were brought out into the world. They were supposed to be these props that stand next to their men. They had to be educated, but only so they could be better mothers, better wives, not to be better themselves, you know? And that's what Forugh Farrokhzad was working against. She was tearing away at this veil, and she wanted to express herself. Is that genius? Yes, probably at the time in Iran, there were many other women with the same equal genius, but it was her valor. It was the way she did it. And it was her endurance to go to I mean, electroshock therapy. Come on, guys. The woman used to go around crying into a mirror. She would hold a mirror up. They would find her walking around her apartment, crying into the mirror. You know, it takes a lot of endurance. And so aside from her poetry and her genius, there was this other aspect of her that made her who she was.
When you read the accounts of her as a child, it seems like she was always very precocious, and she grew up in a big family with brothers, and you know, it seems from a very young age was quite rebellious. But I do think in Iran in mid-50s, or yeah, it's about 1950 that she was getting a divorce. When you got a divorce, that was like the end of the tracks, right? I mean, nobody, like so few women went that far. And I think having done that, having gone that far, having paid the price, which was custody of her son, even just the ability to see her son, having paid that, it was like the ultimate crucible, which then allowed her, I think, to be ever bolder and bolder and bolder. But I think that's the juncture, you know, the crucible on which Forugh Farrokhzad is made, is her divorce as a very young woman from her husband.
Absolutely.
Shabnam, I wanted to maybe swing back to you and talk a little bit about The House is Black, because I do think it's an absolutely stunning documentary, and it blurs some of the boundaries of what we expect in a documentary because of the presence of this her presence and her voice in that documentary. And just to hear a little bit, maybe to share with the audience why it has such an impact, and also, you know, if that's also partly what you're trying to capture in your own work, of marrying the genre of film with poetry.
Yeah, so, you know, I mentioned that when I first saw The House is Black, I think it allowed me to kind of face my own inhibitions and face my own limitations in terms of genre and sort of what I was adhering to based on external structures of art making. And so it was really when I saw that film that I decided that I also was allowed to have anything that I ever create as a scholar, as a filmmaker, as a playwright, to always have poetry in it and have it be a piece of poetry. And so it kind of gave me permission to do that and to expand my possibilities in that way. So certainly in the most explicit sense, this excerpt that you guys saw is a documentary film that also has poetry in it, right? And just to talk a little bit about the film, so The House is Black And some of you, because you've done a lot more research on her lives, maybe you can add to this narrative. But, you know, she was commissioned to make it. She was given like a crew. And the documentary was actually commissioned by, I forget what the actual name was, but it was like a medical institute that wanted to do a documentary about a particular leper colony in Tabriz. And this leper colony was isolated physically. They were marginalized from the community. They were like walled in the community where they lived. And so she did a lot of things in making it that were already really bold and deeply compassionate. And so one is that she entered the leper colony, which, you know, part of the reason for their social isolation was because of this tremendous stigma for these families that lived there. And she entered the colony and actually adopted a boy from that colony. And she died shortly after, but she took him back to where she lived and was raising him essentially. And so what she did was she had this task to make this documentary, but again, you know, she was so unapologetically herself and using her own voice and creating it, so that she uses throughout some excerpts of her own poetry, excerpts from other literature throughout the film. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, you know, the editing, everything is really, really beautiful. And I think it points to how incredibly talented she was as a storyteller also. And what it ultimately does is it allows for a really compassionate view at that time of a community that was so much pushed to the margins and ostracized. And it went on to win, you know, awards at film festivals in Europe. So it's a really beautiful film, and you can find it with subtitles on YouTube and other places as well.
Thank you. Yeah. We're coming close to the end. I wanted to invite you all to share a little bit about your own work now, what you're working on. And there's a question from Marjan Kamali asking about how do you keep yourself motivated and inspired in this particular moment during the pandemic, when, speaking of isolation, we're living in little boxes. So maybe say a little bit about the kinds of projects that you're working on, and then how you're keeping yourself motivated. Sholeh.
Oh, I go first. I'm always motivated. I just love my, you know, I've had a lot to do, so it's fine. And I love my husband, so he keeps me happy. But okay, it's to have a routine during this time. I think you really need to have a routine, otherwise, because the times, the going in and outs of your life has changed. So you need to sort of go to bed early, get up early, or whenever you're if you are a night writer, then stay up late and work. I work in the mornings, I get up. So everybody's different. Right now, what I'm working on, I have a contract for a screenplay. So original screenplay. So I've been very, very busy building that and working that. It's due very soon. And the other thing that's really exciting that I've been working on, as some of you may know, I translated Sufi mystic poet Attar's The Conference of the Birds. If you don't know that book, go get it. Go get my translation. The work, and I'm not saying just my, you know, the work will just change your life. So Fahad Siadat, who's this amazing composer, contacted me, and so I'm writing the libretto based on the Conference of the Birds for a fantastic oratorio. You can contact me and I can send you the website for it, or just put my name, Oratorio Conference of the Birds, and you will see what we're working on.
Jasmine.
So I have a novel coming out. It's my first book that's not about Iran, which is really exciting to me. I'm really excited about it. And so I'm busy, you know, just prepping for the launch there. And then I have another book I'm working on. Huh?
Tell us the name.
Oh, there it is. It's called The Bohemians, and it is, so I write now, I guess what I do now is I write novels about historical figures, and the figures are always women artists. And so this novel, The Bohemians, is a story about Dorothea Lange and her early years in San Francisco in the 1920s. So Dorothea Lange, the great photographer, you probably know her from her Depression era work and the photograph Migrant Mother. So that's exciting. And then I've got a novel under contract. That's how I get motivated, is I get myself in these situations where I'm contractually obliged to write, and it's been working for me. I mean, the terror of the deadline is what keeps me going.
Great. So I'm working on a book right now, a book of poetry, entitled All Children Magazine, that's actually modeled after, when I was 12 years old, my father and I tried to do like a highlights kids magazine, but in Farsi. So it was a bilingual kids magazine that we were trying to like give to kids so they would like be interested, and I would like translate stories and do things like that, very simple stuff. But the format of it is something that was really special to me, like something that's specifically for children. So I'm writing a book of poetry that's for adults, but for the child inside of the adult. And I'm also working on, the feature length, essentially, of the short that we just saw. So we're in production for No Separate Survival. So that's primarily what I'm working on now. And then I'm making some other short documentaries. But I wanted to say, also, I want to say that the routine has really, really been useful for me also. I think there's so many variables and so much external inconsistency that it can serve as a really stabilizing anchor for yourself. It's something that you can do. And this is really whether or not we're in these circumstances. Having a routine as an artist, I think, is a really imperative. Having it be a practice so that you're doing it even when you're not motivated to do it. If that's the case, you're always doing it. So I think that's really useful.
Sholeh and Jasmine, what's the name of that movie that you were both in about Forugh? I wanted to make sure I put that for the audience as well. Only the Voice Remains?
Only Voice Remains, and that's on, how do you say it, Vimeo? I don't even know how to say it. Vimeo, but Sholeh and I both participated in a really, a very beautiful, short 40-minute documentary that brings together an artistic interpretation of Forugh's life with scholarly insight. So I recommend that, and it's all available on, tell me again how I pronounce it, Vimeo?
Vimeo.
Well, you know what I mean. It's spelled, yeah, Vemo, Vimeo.
Okay, so Only the Voice Remains is this documentary. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're kind of coming to the end of our time together, and I just want to say thank you so much. I have infinite respect and love for all of you and the work you're doing, and it's so great to partner with the Poetry Center to bring a little life in this otherwise challenging time through the voice of Forugh and the work you've done, inspired by her. Yes. So I encourage all the audience members to follow these authors, but also follow the work that they're doing to keep Forugh's legacy alive in various ways, either directly or indirectly. And I think that we're so grateful to the Poetry Center for their interest in this wonderful Iranian poet who belongs to the world. And although we can't necessarily teach her in Iran, any of you who are teachers, I encourage you to include her poetry, because now we have really good translations in your courses, either in college or high school. So thank you so much, Steve and Elise from the Poetry Center, and thanks to all the folks who helped us in the background to make this a successful event. Stay safe, stay out of trouble, and good riddance to 2020. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.